Hey guys, Mr. Morgan here with another instructional video for remote learning. Today is 10/27. What we're going to do today is first we are going to complete a quick activity for the electoral process in the United States because the US election is coming up and we are going to cover it somewhat. And at the end of this tiny mini unit for the electoral process and the US election, we are going to be doing our own vote to see who New Haven Junior High would elect president were we given the chance. After we do that, we are going to cover the Nile River as part of our Ancient Egypt mini unit as well. So our homework for this week is the Egypt Pyramids Among Us activity that we did yesterday for our e-learning. Some of you had issues with the video. I changed the link so the video should work now. You should be able to hear everything. You have until Saturday to complete that, but it's only 10 questions and a little bit of reading, so it shouldn't take you all that long. If you do have some more issues with it, reach out to me. I tried to fix it, but if there's still some issues, let me know. So let's go ahead and get started with the electoral process. So what you need to do is find the assignment in the module titled 2020 election, and then open the 3 links and answer the questions, and then submit it when you are done. So what it's going to do is cover who can run for president, the 3 things that you need to have to be eligible to be president, and then the nomination process and how you actually get elected, what the process is like, and then it's going to talk a little bit about the Electoral College and what it is. Okay, so the PDF worksheet that you were given has 3 links to the libraryofcongress.gov, one over the requirements for what it takes and what a person has to be in order to run for president, the 3 things laid out in the U.S. Constitution, and then how people actually run for presidency, the nomination process, and then how they try to get elected, and then the Electoral College and the function and purpose of that. So go ahead, read through those, answer the couple of questions that are given to you, and then submit that, and we will talk about that a little bit more tomorrow when we start to cover our next thing. So I will explain this in more detail tomorrow, and we will start to cover the next aspect, which is voting rights. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and get started on our notes for today over ancient Egypt. So today, in regards to ancient Egypt, we are going to talk about the Nile River. Before we even talk about anything regarding ancient Egypt, the people in Egypt, the pharaohs, and the pyramids, which we should have talked about this before. We talked about it yesterday, but anything when it comes to Egypt, we first need to talk about the Nile River. So the Nile River and the ancient Egyptians are one of the few river valley civilizations that we see. There are a couple, the Indus River Valley in India, and then we see the Tigris and Euphrates, the Nile River, and then one in China. These are all some of the first massive civilizations that we see in the world, and they all focus around large rivers like the Nile, which are really good at supporting life and are really useful for the civilizations that live near them, which is why we see such large civilizations in these areas. So our goal for today is to explain and understand how the Nile River supplies life or supports life for the civilizations of ancient Egypt. So first I'm going to start with a quote from a Greek historian named Herodotus. Egypt is the gift of the Nile. So he's saying that the Nile River, the great Egyptian civilization, he is saying that this great civilization is given to us because of the Nile. Without the Nile, we would not have Egypt or the pyramids or the pharaohs or any of these sorts of things that we see in this area. Without the Nile, none of these things could be possible. So Herodotus was a Greek historian who explored Egypt and wrote all of his observations, like any other number of historians that we're going to cover later, like a Marco Polo or Christopher Columbus or any of these explorers. He traveled all over the Nile, but he never found the river source. So we're actually going to talk about the river source here in a second. So here is a map of the Nile on the left. This is just a satellite view. So it's one of the largest rivers in the world. It's the longest river. It's the largest river in Africa, and there is a lot of population around it. So when we think of Egypt, we think of a lot of a desert, which we're not wrong when we think of that. Egypt is covered almost entirely by desert, except for places along the Nile. So if we look at this map on the left, we can see that the Nile, which is this line kind of curving through there, we can see that there is a lot of green around it. That is because the Nile provides a bunch of fertile land for all of these crops and all of these green things to grow. So if we look at the image on the right, that photo, well, one, we can see a boat traveling along the Nile, but we can also see lots of trees and grass and bushes and shrubs and whatnot along the river's bank. So along the river and near the river, we see a lot of fertile land, which is why we have such green on the map. So the Nile River, the world's longest river, the Nile flows north. So most times when we think about rivers, we think about them flowing from a large body of water, which would be, in this case, the Mediterranean Sea. We would imagine that the Mediterranean Sea flows down and feeds the Nile River, but we actually see that the Nile flows north from its sources in East Africa. So we have two sources for the Nile to the Mediterranean Sea for more than 4,000 miles. There are two sources of the Nile River, which is why Herodotus couldn't find it, because it wasn't just a single source like when we see something like the Mississippi River. It comes from a single source and goes towards the Gulf of Mexico. With the Nile, we have two sources, which is why it took so long for people to understand the actual source of the Nile. The two sources of the Nile River, the Blue Nile and the White Nile, these two rivers meet in present-day Sudan. So when we look at a map, it starts with the Nile River being very strong in Egypt, and then it forks, and we see a split, and it goes one into modern-day Ethiopia, and then one to Lake Victoria, surrounded by a bunch of different countries like Uganda, Burundi, Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania. So let's start with the Blue Nile. The Blue Nile flows from Lake Tana in modern-day Ethiopia and has some amazing, beautiful waterfalls as some of its key characteristics. And then we have the White Nile. So the White Nile flows from Lake Victoria in Eastern Africa, and Lake Victoria is probably the strongest source for the Nile that we see. If we go back to another map, we can see that a lot of the river comes from Lake Victoria. So we see two different civilizations along the Nile, and they often get interlinked because they are incredibly similar. So that first one we see is the ancient Nubians. So when we look at a map and we see something like Upper and Lower Egypt or Lower and Upper Nubia, we often get kind of confused, because when you think about, when you look at it on the map, the lower is on the top and the upper is on the bottom. So it's just kind of confusing that way, but it's just how the Nile works. You have Lower Egypt closer towards the Mediterranean Sea, and you have Lower Nubia closer towards the Mediterranean Sea. So this is mainly because a lot of the society was focused along the areas closer to the Mediterranean Sea. So that is where they started, and they went out from there. And then you see lower, then upper. You start from the bottom, which they at first thought was Mediterranean Sea, or they first imagined and thought of as the main Mediterranean Sea as like the main spot, and then they went out towards Lower and Upper Egypt and Lower and Upper Nubia. So Upper Nubia, 2 miles of farmland on each side of the river. This is the bottom part. This is really useful for all the planting crops in the area. 2 miles of farmland on each side, and then Lower Nubia, lots of desert and granite mountains line the area, and so it lines the riverbanks, which leaves very little land for farming. So Upper Nubia is a little bit flatter and allows for a lot more farmland to be grown out there. They can bring that water out, they can irrigate it, and not the ways that we see now through pipes, but through more basic or rudimentary ways. They can feed a lot of that water, and they can let the flooding allow a lot of that water to create more farmland in Upper Nubia. Lower Nubia has these granite mountains, which doesn't allow the flooding to go out as far and create as much fertile land, which we're going to talk about the flooding and fertile land later. So it rarely rained in Lower Nubia. People had to live close to the river for their water supply. So this is what we're going to see a lot in these sort of areas, that people live close to the Nile, because the Nile, and as we have seen so far in the semester, a lot of bodies of water are where people tend to congregate and focus. And so we see this, especially with the Nile. People live close to the water for a number of reasons. So ancient Nubia and ancient Egypt often get tied together because they were so interrelated. So the Nubians often are thought of as other Egyptians. So we talked about the Nubians somewhat before, but some of the Egyptian pharaohs were actually of Nubian descent, and so they get brought together. Royals in each group had similar, or sometimes even the same, royal symbols. So their like memorabilia and their flags and everything, that their like logo essentially would be incredibly similar and sometimes the same. A lot of the things that they did, they traded with each other, and so they had very similar technologies. The Egyptians called the Nubians, or the Nubia, the place of the land of the bow, because the Nubians were so skilled at archery. So they were the ancient Nubians and the ancient Egyptians were both incredibly advanced for their time, both in warfare and then just in technological advancements. So the two fought each other at times, and then there were times where they were incredibly peaceful and they traded things such as farming and iron tools. So now we have ancient Egypt. So this is a lot more farmland in certain areas. So in Upper Egypt, our bottom half, the 6 miles, we have 6 miles of farmland on each side of the river for planting crops. It's a lot more flat, and so the Nile floods a lot more of the area, and so we get a lot of farmland down in the lower part, or the upper part. The southern part, we see a lot of farmland there. And then in Lower Egypt, close to the Mediterranean Sea, in the north, the Nile spreads out to form a fertile marshy area. So this bit up at the top where we see it fan out, where we see it sort of finger out in all these little tributaries, we have the Nile Delta. So as the river comes to the end, it starts to push more and more silt out and create a bunch of different smaller parts of the Nile River, rather than one really strong river flowing through all of it towards the Mediterranean Sea. It branches out and spreads into a bunch of different tributaries and deltas. So it fans out at the end, and what it does is, as it does that, it brings a lot more fertile and wet land. When I say fertile, think more wet and good for farming. It brings a lot of this wet land out, and it's very marshy, similar to what we would see in a place like Louisiana or even parts of Florida. So very, very wet in these areas. So here we can see that fanning out even more. So this is a map of Lower Egypt. So we can see that it's very strong until we get to about Giza, where we see the Great Pyramid. This is where we think of the pyramid is in Giza, and then we have our major city of Cairo, and then it starts to branch out, and we see a lot of cities out along all these smaller rivers, and even closer to the ports. So now we're going to talk about 3 of the main ways that the Nile supports life in the area. So the Nile River the river brings rich, fertile sediment called silt. So what it does is it brings sand and ground from earlier. As the stream is flowing, it collects dirt and pulls dirt, and what it does is on the shoreline it will leave some of that some of that dirt and some of that sediment called silt, and it will leave it on the edge of the riverbank. And as it floods routinely every year, it will leave a lot of that silt out everywhere, and that soil will be incredibly useful for farming. So each summer, the river would flood, leaving this dark soil, this silt, which the ancient Egyptians called Kemet, or the Black Land. So this black soil and the silt, which they would call the Black Land, was incredibly useful for farming. So they could use that and they could bring it to places and allow that farmland to grow crops. And it would routinely, about the same time every summer, so they would just know, back away a little bit and then let it flood. And then when it's done flooding around the same time every year, we come back in, plant all our crops, and we can harvest the crops, and then we can move back out around the same time the next year, and then we'll be good and we can go back and forth. And this allowed for a lot of crops to be grown very efficiently every year, whereas some rivers, they flood a little bit more randomly, and so it makes it hard to get a solid large amount of crops to feed people in the area. So this routine flooding allowed for larger amounts of crops and increased populations. With increased populations came more advanced cities and civilizations in the area and better technology in the area, larger kingdoms, stronger militaries, which allowed them to become more dominant and more powerful and take over other groups and just grow and grow and grow. And this can all be brought back to the Nile River, allowing for larger harvests every year. So outside of the Black Land, we have what would be called the Red Land. So this is the desert. The blistering desert beyond the Black Land was called the Red Land because it was so much drier. It was very red, which if we look at this picture on the right, we can see if we go past this dry sort of light brown color, we can see these red sort of hills. So this red, orangish sort of color, this is the Red Land. So living along the Nile. So like I said earlier, a lot of people live along the Nile, and this wasn't just because there was, this is where all the food and the water would be. It was for a number of other reasons. So as wind, for example, would go over the Nile River, it would cool down the wind and create a cooler breeze coming in, which would be more comfortable for people. So that would be one reason why we see living along the Nile. Another is certain things like when you combine earth or dirt with water, it creates mud. And so mud and straw together you could use to create really strong bricks for houses, which is good for the people in the area so they can build houses out of these bricks. So closer to the water makes it easier to have these bricks, which then they can build these more advanced houses rather than, things made out of just wood and straw or very basic houses. They can make more advanced ones, which is what we see in this picture here. So settled farming communities began to appear in both Egypt and Nubia around 5000 BC. We're going to talk more about the timeline of ancient Egypt tomorrow. So before this, before we start to see these farming communities, we mostly just see hunters and fishermen in the area going after the game like antelope and things like that, and then fishing the fish in the river, because with the cooler temperatures and the plant life in the area, you're going to see a lot more animals coming into the area, which then hunters and fishermen. But as we see people start to farm, we see things like livestock. So they start to keep things like goats, for example, and other animals. They keep with their family in order to have a supply of something like goat's milk or eggs. So homes were built of straw or of bricks made from a mix of mud and straw, like I said earlier. So we can see a example of an Egyptian home. So they often had 2 floors in it, and the top floor would be for a bunch of different things. You could use that to dry certain meats to allow them to last a little bit longer, eating up their all sorts of different things. We see in the houses, we also see things like small windows, which allow light in the house, and then cooler temperatures. So we see that these homes aren't just rudimentary, basic houses. They are more advanced things like gates, and then places to store grain and food, and allow things to ferment and make bread. So we see houses are advanced, and as people start to sell in the area, society gets more and more advanced in the area, which we're going to see later when we talk about technological advancements of the Egyptian people. So another thing we see, or our last thing we see, is trade. So the Nile River allowed ships and sailboats to travel along it. So if you put a ship along the Nile River, it could just naturally flow along with the current towards the Mediterranean Sea and all of the ports. The Nile River also wasn't incredibly far from things like the Red Sea and eastern ports, and so they could travel um, through the desert, which I'm going to talk about here in a second. But if you put a sail on the boat, you could then use that sail and then some manpower in order to go upstream along the Nile to places a little bit further inland, away from the ports along the Mediterranean Sea, in order to trade with people there. So the Nile River connected people from the Mediterranean Sea up along the river. And then, as I was saying earlier, we see other trade routes ran across the desert to other seaports, or to Mesopotamia and modern day places like Iraq and Iran, where there is another major civilization, another river valley civilization there. So we see that people along the Nile River could use the Nile River to get towards Mediterranean seaports, or travel not too far towards the Red Sea and seaports there. So Egyptian traders would trade things like gold, silver, copper, pottery, cedar wood, and then other goods like silk, or different sorts of foods, or animal hides, or all sorts of different sorts of things that they could get from people nearby, or things that they couldn't necessarily get in the area. If they went to a Mediterranean seaport, they could trade with people in Greece or Rome and get a bunch of different types of goods like grapes and wine from Rome and Greece. So that is all for the Nile. So what you need to do now is open up the discussion board, and which should be linked in the assignment, where we have our PDF notes, and you need to explain how the Nile River allowed for larger civilizations in ancient Egypt. So we talked about um, the source of the Nile, and then some of the people in the area around the Nile. And then we talked about 3 reasons, or 3 ways, that the Nile helps people in the area. So I want you to explain how the Nile River supports life for civilizations of ancient Egypt. Okay, with all of that, I think we are done for the day. Yep, that's it. So if you have any questions, let me know how I can help. Tomorrow we are going to talk about voting rights in U.S. elections, and how we have seen those change over time. And then we are going to talk about a timeline for ancient Egypt. Okay, you guys have a great day. I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye.